Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's events in St. Thomas's Church. I hope you are all having a wonderful weekend and looking forward to a wonderful evening this evening. I'd like to ask you to make sure that all your mobile phones are turned off, please. We are going to start proceedings this evening with Leisha Kelly, our musician, and who is going to perform our first song. Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you very much. I'd like to call upon Ulrike Gasser, Director of the Goethe Institute in Dublin, to introduce our first reader, Roman Ehrlich.
Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome Roman Ehrlich to this special event, the Goethe-Institut Irland's Writer of Residence 2023 at the Heinrich Böll Cottage. My name is Ulrike Gasser. I'm the director of the Institute in Ireland and very delighted to attend the Heinrich Böll Memorial Weekend for the first time here in Eckel. First of all, I want to say thank you to the Heinrich Böll Association for partnering up with the Goethe-Institut since so many years and for the good cooperation with John McHugh to find a suitable writer for our joint residency every year. It is so impressive, fascinating, and also touching how the heritage of the great German author and Nobel Prize winner Heinrich Böll is being remembered and maintained here. A supporter of human dignity and human rights, a pacifist and a writer of a quality that one country can only rarely produce. What takes place here is cultural exchange in its finest form, and I'm deeply grateful to be able to contribute to it in the name of the Goethe-Institut. Some of you know, probably most of you know, the Goethe-Institut is Germany's cultural institute, and we promote the knowledge of the German language, we convey a contemporary image of Germany, and we foster cultural collaboration and exchange. Here in Ireland, we opened our doors more than 60 years ago in 1961. We operate from a European perspective, and we work independently without any political ties. Through maintaining and building relationships with partners from the cultural and educational sectors in Ireland, dear partners like the Heinrich Böll Association. So as a result of this today, we have the opportunity to meet and hear from one of the most talented and innovative writers of contemporary German literature, Roman Ehrlich. Roman was born in 1983 in Aichach and grew up in Neuburg an der Donau. He studied at the German Literature Institute in Leipzig and at the Free University of Berlin. He has published 4 novels, a collection of stories, and in 2015 he also began a collaboration with the visual artist Michael Disquet for a series of phototext essays. Roman received several prizes and scholarships for his work, most recently the Kunstpreis Berlin for Literature in March 2022, and right now he's one out of 6 finalists for the Alfred Döblin Prize. Fingers crossed, dear Roman. His last publications include the novel Malé and Überfahrt. Roman Ehrlich's works explore themes such as climate change, violence, isolation, and survival in a world that is constantly changing and challenging. His style is characterized by a poetic and precise language, a subtle sense of humor, and a visionary imaginations. His novels created dystopian scenarios that are both realistic and surreal. His stories are full of surprising twists and turns, unexpected encounters, and memorable characters. Roman Ehrlich is not only a brilliant storyteller, but also a keen observer and critic of our society and culture. He reflects on the role of literature, art, and media in shaping our perception and understanding of reality. We are very fortunate to have Roman Ehrlich with us today. He will read from his latest novel, Malé, which tells the story of a group of dropouts from the Western country to a tropical island that is threatened by rising sea levels. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Roman Ehrlich.
Good evening. Good evening. This is better. Yes, thank you very much, Ulrike, for the introduction and for the invitation, and thank you everybody involved in making this possible for this weekend, and especially for the wonderful atmosphere up at the cottage where I already feel at home even though I just arrived yesterday. It's beautiful there, and yeah, I cannot thank you enough for that. Yeah. I will read to you an excerpt from my novel Malé, as mentioned. It is a sample translation that was made by the American-German author Isabel Cole. The novel itself is not translated in its entirety, so that saved me from the work of finding a good passage for today. So I can just start reading to you, but maybe a few words to what is happening there and what's the premise of the book. I started out when I wrote this novel by wanting to write something about, or write a book where the main protagonist is a place rather than a person or a group of people. And I have the habit of spending too much time online with Google Maps, and I'm kind of constantly on travels with that application. And one day I found by accident, I found the capital of the Maldives. It is called Malé. And I saw it on the satellite map as the shape that it is. It's just like this island that is like every square inch is concrete. It's all houses and streets, like tall houses up until its very edges. And it fascinated me, and I started to read a lot about it. And then I thought, okay, the book that has a place as the main protagonist has to take place there. And it is set in a future where, yeah, the sea levels have risen, and all the developments that we see already came to a point they passed the infamous tipping point. They're irreversible, and the system of the Maldives, the political system, collapsed, and most people left the country. And only after a while, this kind of new society started settling there, of people who couldn't really find a home where they grew up, or they were fleeing from something or someone, or just in the search for a different life. So yeah, that's the place this takes place in, and there's a whole lot of supporting roles and people whose stories are captured in this book. And the main two characters, I would say, of the book are absent. It's also the love story that is taking place in the book is also absent, because the people are gone, the main protagonists. And it's a German actor and a German poet, or actress, I guess I would have to say. And they disappeared, and now the actress's father and a literary scholar are in search for both of them. They came to the island to see what happened with them. And I guess here I can start. In the spot where Francis Ford is standing by the murky wall of windows, in the light of the grimy panes struck by the afternoon sun, glaring through the clouds, all the dust, the salt, and the filth on the glass flaring golden, the dark blue carpeting has faded with the years. Even when the sun vanishes behind the heavy drift of the clouds, when the shine of the filthy panes dims away, Francis Ford is left standing in a light, pale blue rectangle in the deserted breakfast room of the Royal Raman Residence Hotel, on what is now known as Daisy Street, in a district called Steerson Patch, by the city's new inhabitants, probably harking back to one of the early pioneers who first settled here after the total collapse of the island republic. A thick layer of dust has settled on the furniture. Even the air, which hasn't stirred in years, is coated with dust, old and dead, thinks Francis Ford. And each breath of that dusty air stings the nose and fills the lungs with a heavy feeling that makes the heart all dark with shadow. In the whole vast room, plunged in permanent darkness farther inside the building, there was nowhere the two of them felt like sitting down. For the past several days, the water has stood nearly knee-deep in the streets, Through the grime on the windows, Francis Ford can detect the shape of a vehicle moving away from the hotel and turning into a narrow street. An amphibious vehicle with big tires and a ship's hull. She's already seen several of them in the city. Maybe it's just the same one each time that she keeps seeing because there's such a limited space to move in here. Though she can't really see it through the dirty glass, already Francis Ford can easily fill in the image from memory. The vehicle drawing its track through the dark, oily water, little waves forming wedge-shaped at its stern and surging out toward the sides of the street, sloshing against the walls of the buildings where they roil the plastic bottles and other trash that's collected there. Francis Ford arranged to meet the father of the deceased actress Mona Bauch in the breakfast room of the Royal Roman Residence Hotel because the hotel, like the actress Mona Bauch, is mentioned often in the writings of the poet Judy Frank, the man she's come searching for in vain, whose journals, letters and poems have sunk under her skin and into her soul, just as the moisture has sunk into the walls of this lost city. Francis Ford arrived in Malé about a week and a half before the father of the actress Mona Bauch. She senses that in terms of knowing the conditions on the ground, she has a head start over the distraught man. At the same time, she feels that she has less time left before her drive, strength, and will are utterly consumed by the all-encompassing inertia, the humid weather and that hangs heavy overhead, the rain, the gnawing waves, and the spring tides that the pale moon drags across the island. The distraught father has just started his search, and he has information that Francis Ford lacks. 2 months ago, somewhere in this former capital of the Republic, the actress Mona Bauch appears to have taken her own life. Her dead body has been found, witnesses have given detailed accounts of thereof, and 2 different, highly unappetizing photographs of a grossly disfigured, drowned body were circulating in the internet for a time. Presumably it was cremated on one of the nearby atolls or buried in a mass grave. The poet Judy Frank, however, has vanished without a trace. His possibly simultaneous suicide is a mere speculation. They are presumed to have left together. Back home in Germany, the father of the actress Mona Bauch is on a last name basis with his employees, while his friends, back in their school days, made the last name into a nickname with a mild mockery of affection, Belly. Yesterday in the bar, when asked for his name, he didn't know how to introduce himself. Bauch seemed too formal, Belly too private, and his actual first name seemed as strange as though it belonged to someone else. Elmar Bauch realized how long it had been since he'd met anyone new or had to introduce himself to a stranger outside the workplace. He decided to introduce himself in the function that had brought him to the island, as the father of the deceased actress Mona Bauch, to make it clear from the outset what sort of information he hoped to obtain from the locals. Clarification, a background against which something like mourning would be possible, hopefully relieving the dull numbness that has swathed him ever since a celebrity check push notification on his device informed him of the death of his own daughter. In the bar where the distraught father went yesterday to start getting his bearings on the island, he was told that his daughter had left a sort of farewell letter, and that there might be a willingness to give him access to that letter. Something could be contrived, a meeting arranged for mutual benefit. Francis Ford overheard the conversation at the bar counter between the newcomer and the muscular, strict and uncompromising Dutch woman Hedy Peck. Francis Ford offered to meet the helpless-seeming father at the Royal Roman Residence Hotel on Daisy Street the next day, saying that she had no deal to offer him, nor perhaps could she really help him, but her search and his overlapped in a way that might interest him. Francis Ford explains to the father, who is standing a bit farther behind her in the room, not in the pale rectangle of carpet, but still in the light of the windows. I come from a pretty part of the US where we still get properly cold winters and very green and vibrant springs. And I majored in German at the university in my hometown and did my PhD on contemporary German literature. I was most interested in the poets born after the turn of the millennium, amid the turmoil after 9/11, the major financial crises, and all the contradictions of that time, and putting it very broadly, how they tried to capture that in their poems from their perspective in Europe, with Germany's unique history, where I focused on the motive of the blue blossom, which was such an important symbol for the Romantics and played a role in East Germany too, and often got used later as a code for the politics of the far right. I don't know if you're interested in contemporary German poetry, but the symbol of the blue flower is quite pervasive. The whole body of Romantic symbolism has had a renaissance in German poetry over the past several decades. My thesis supervisor, who I was working for at the university, wanted me to advance my academic career and publish papers, and he kept trying to nudge me towards new projects. But I didn't want to advance my career. Actually, I didn't even want a university job anymore. A few months ago, my thesis advisor went to a conference in Germany and brought me back the entire posthumous papers of the German poet Judy Frank, which at the time we didn't know were posthumous. But meanwhile, I believe that Judy Frank is no longer living, and that's connected in part with your daughter. While the literary scholar Francis Ford holds forth, the father of the actress Mona Bauch listens with a patience he's never known before. He registers every detail with hyper-clarity and total vividness, feeling that at last someone is setting out to explain all the things that have been so incomprehensible, unreal, and nightmarish. The father of the actress Mona Bauch has never taken any interest in contemporary German poetry. The poet Judy Frank, Francis Ford continues, holding up her hands between herself and the highly attentive father as she counts off on her fingers, brought out 9 books of poetry with his German publisher. Lingering Under a Floating Load, Motorized Maids, World Without End, The Rascals from the Third Reich, My Life as a Child, A Twig and a Twin, Eclipses, The Vibe of Wittenberg, and Salmon, My Bunny. Before announcing to his publisher that he was heading for Malé because he didn't like it on the mainland anymore. Frank hoped that here in Malé, with the émigrés, he could find a milieu like the 1980s West Berlin he'd always pictured. West Berlin was an island surrounded by East Germany, a bit lost, a place where people only wanted to go if they were already a bit crazy and couldn't cope with regular society. The father of the deceased actress tells Francis Ford, still staring at her fingers, which, after counting off Judy Frank's poetry collections, have interlaced in a shape that makes him think the words Indian teepee, that Mona was also fascinated by the history of divided Berlin, and he recalled her once saying that the only Berlin she'd like to live in was that West Berlin of the old days. I don't think she ever really warmed to the real Berlin of today, and Pretty soon after that, she went to France and then to California. I would have rather she'd stayed in California or come back to Germany, but of course she didn't ask me. She was a grown woman by then. I had no conception of this whole situation here, but I thought it might be dangerous. Frances Ford nods without looking him in the face. She is trying to keep her distance from the distraught father's grief. She senses that this man is beginning to see her as someone or something who or which might be able to relieve him of a very painful, very frustrating job by fitting together jumbled puzzle pieces to make a whole, comprehensible picture. Frank came here 3 years ago, and he kept sending emails and manuscripts and journals to his publisher in Germany. He probably figured that in Germany the publisher would sort everything out and publish it and wire him some money, but the publisher became seriously ill and died, and his wife had no interest in keeping the business going. She sorted out all their correspondence and the archives, set up various hard drives, printed emails, deleted accounts, and then divvied it all up among the first takers. And so the things ended up with me by way of my thesis advisor. I knew Judy Frank's poetry books already, but his island diaries, poems, sketches, and letters from Malé fascinated me far more than the published books. First, I tried to contact him through the publisher's widow, then I tried to write him directly, and then, when none of that worked out, I asked my thesis advisor for a leave of absence and came here looking for this German poet, which is kind of crazy, because he probably isn't even alive anymore, and I can't say what would happen if I did find him. I mean, what I think ought to happen. Maybe I wouldn't even have come here if I hadn't already known there's no hope. I'm afraid I can't help you here. I didn't get many emails from my daughter while she was living here, but if you think it would help, we can take another look at them together. I'm pretty sure that your daughter and Judy Frank were a couple, or at least romantically involved. My hunch is that Frank had a pet name for your daughter. If so, he called her Luna, and she actually turns up quite a bit in his writing. Luna. Elmar Bauch says his daughter's pet name several times out loud, and he doesn't like it one bit, the way the word inexorably spreads, covering his brain and the memory of his child. I can't even tell you how awful that is. Luna. It's hard to say what to make of the whole affair with your daughter's farewell letter, but my advice is, be careful not to get taken advantage of. In her mind, Frances Ford adds the words, "in the hour of your greatest weakness." After the Royal Roman Residence Hotel shut down, its rooms never ended up being rented or squatted on a long-term basis. Here and there, bed frames still hold moldy mattresses, but most of the rooms have been cleaned out. Everything of value has been unscrewed and pried off. There's no electricity, and the water pipes have been rusty and defunct for ages. Judy Frank tried to describe the hotel over and over. He wanted to find a language that would transcend the usual disaster tourism and the fascination of ruins, expressing the nature of this place that human beings have ceded to fungi and mites to build their microscopic societies. Frances Ford and Elmar Bauch climb up through the stories of the abandoned hotel building to the very top, the rooftop terrace, which Ford claims was a romantic rendezvous for the two missing people. From the stairwell, they can never see more than a few yards down the dark corridors, which emanate a silence that they counter with excessive panting and sighing as they climb to keep it from swallowing them up. Elmar Bauch recalls his daughter writing in an email from Malé, that the city is filled with places that urge silence on you. At the landing below the last floor, they can already hear the breaking of the waves through the open door to the terrace, the eternal unrest of the Indian Ocean that hardly ever lies peaceful, flat, and turquoise as in the tourist brochures from the old days. Instead, it's in constant motion, wild and foamy and roaring, churning darkly and utterly infested with the trash of humanity. Even before they step out onto the terrace, the sea penetrates their noses too. Each breath is saturated with the salty taste of all the organic matter that ever perished and slowly dissolved in that salt water. Oily and caustic, the taste trickles from the nose down to the throat, filling the oral cavity and coating the tongue with a greasy film. The rooftop terrace of the Royal Roman Residence Hotel is floored with weathered wooden planks that rise to flat platforms surrounding a large swimming pool, once crowded with deck chairs and sunshades. Someone turned the rectangular planters at the edge of the platforms into raised beds for various plants, marijuana, carrots, sage, parsley, before apparently losing interest some time ago and leaving the plants to fend for themselves. In the large, white-tiled cavity of the swimming pool, a swampy biotope has formed in the years of abandonment, green stalks moving in the wind, interspersed with duckweed and ferns and rotting leaves. The hotel is not the tallest building on the island, but the shores can be seen in all directions, every spare yard built up with houses and streets. Down at the end of each street, the same image, mountainous waves rolling up, veined with white foam, collapsing with a crash, sucked back into the next breaker. The flood walls erected on the edge of the coral reef to counter the constant work of the sea have already crumbled and collapsed in numerous places. The shallow layer of water in the streets, left over from the last rainfalls, is traversed by calm, even swells. Nowhere in the city are the ground floors still occupied or commercially used. All of life takes place on the upper floors. Frances Ford sees several pigs on a roof across the way, crowding together as they eat from a trough. She thinks, all that happens in this place is time passing. The sea and its tireless work of erasure are the apotheosis of the passage of time. It's been a long while since anything else happened in this city. People seem to have forgotten that they once had a future. Frances Ford looks around the terrace of the Royal Roman Residence Hotel, trying to disregard the wind-tousled father of the actress Mona Bauch, and recall how full of yearning the place seemed in Judy Frank's descriptions. She thinks, the beauty of the description can't lie in the things that are described. It must reflect the yearning that another person feels and describes in your stead. She thinks, what a sad thing it is when human habitations no longer harbor human life. And then, in her head, clear and vivid as though in a closed room, she hears her own voice say a sequence of words that seem both familiar and primordially strange, like the first beings that once crawled on land to become our forebearers. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, says the voice. Frances Ford can't help giving a very brief laugh before turning to the distraught father, who is looking at her with questioning eyes. Thank you much.
Thank you, Ronan. I'd like to invite Rennie Böll to say a few words, please.
Good evening. First of all, I want to express my endless gratitude to the Heinrich Böll Committee for the organization. So many events now for the past 20 years, and to take care of our house since 1992. I know it's a very big effort for such a small community like Eckel to have to run this house. It's much better done than our house in Germany. And to organize the only Heinrich Böll festival in the world, what takes cake in heaven. It's in Eckel. Even in Berlin, with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, with 500 employees in all over the world, there's not such an event like this marvelous Heinrich Böll weekend. And I want to give my special gratitude to the Böll Committee, or Böll Association, as you call it, to John McHugh, done his work for so many years now, to Casey, her husband, and all the other members of the committee. Taking care for our old home, giving the possibility to artists, writers, musicians, and other artists to have the experience we had, the hospitality and friendship of the people of Eckel, and to enjoy the landscape of Eckel. I think really Eckel is our home. We're coming here since 1955 when I was 6 years old, and my 7th birthday was on Eckel. Eckel changed a lot in nearly 70 years, and we hope that the unique environment, as we learned yesterday and today, will not only be preserved but even improved in the next future. Hans Magnus Enzensberger said once, "The tourist destroys what he is looking for, finding it." I think it's a very good speech when you think on the Keam Bay and other places on Eckel, filming the banshees of Ingerin, and now it's impossible to go there. I think so. I want to thank also in the name of my parents and my brothers Vincent and Raymond for the marvelous time we had on Eckel. My father said once, "Ireland is the country I most love in Europe." Thank you very much. Now I try to speak something in Gaelic, so you are prepared. Go rachta machta God, da forja God.
Ítach. Fair play, Renee. Shangailga. I love being part of this weekend, and I was very honoured to be part of the Bolus celebration before COVID in Berlin. And I'll be back in Berlin in August for the Last Rose of Summer Festival in the Berlin Embassy building. So I look forward to maybe see some of you there. So I'll play some tunes. This one is a composition of a great fiddle player called Tommy Peoples, and it's very, he has lots of dark music, but this is quite uplifting. Beautiful Guthrie, East County Donegal. And then I go into an old tune, very old tune, a kind of clan march, and it's the March of O'Sullivan Bear. And he was an incredible person in the 1600s from the southwest corner, and he marched all the way up to Leitrim, trying to defeat the English. But anyway, it's a very long story, but the tune is very pretty. And then I'll finish up with another different type of rhythm, reel, that's from Canada. So I play these for John McHugh, who asked for something abstract. So this is the opposite of that, sorry.
Fabulous stuff, Lucia. Now I'd like to invite the panel for the discussion to the stage, please. So we have Gisela Hofter, Michael O'Loughlin, Sujata Bhatt, and Michael Agustin. Okay, you just take a seat. And then the ambassador. I'd like to invite, good evening, Ambassador. I'd like to invite the Ambassador to the stage to introduce our Joyce Böll discussion. Ambassador Cord Mahler.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Glad to see you again. To this the introduction of the discussion, Joyce, Böll, Europeans, or as we called it in the previous event, Joyce, Böll, outsiders, insiders, Europeans. I think the first part of the introduction I already did yesterday, but maybe not everybody was there, when I briefly explained how it all came about, when I met with Finance Minister Pascal Donohoe, talking from finance to literature, and when he created that wonderful formula of the beautiful symmetry of the last year with 100 years of Ulysses, 50 years of Ireland joining the EU, or the referendum it was, and the 50 years of Heinrich Böll's Nobel Prize for Literature. So step two, when we had decided we'll do something about it, was that we brainstormed. Gisela was among the director of the Museum of Literature in Dublin and some others. Why this juxtaposition of two writers, quite different at first glance, right, would be more than just coincidence or serendipity or whatever you may call it. Now, when thinking of it, one saying by John Cage came to my mind. He once said, if something is boring to you after 2 minutes, try it for 4 minutes. If it's still boring, try 8, and so on, and you will find it interesting. So you could translate it, if something doesn't seem to gel at first glance after 2 minutes, try it for 4 minutes, and then for 8 and 16. That's what we did, Gisela, right? In a way. Slightly differently, but yes. And then suddenly one came up with the interesting trouvailles, as the French would say, findings. For example, that both Ulysses, a little bit materialistic mindset of the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany as the somewhat better world. And the message in his book, we thought, might be seen first and foremost for the audience back home. Joyce, on the other hand, lived, as we know, in many different places abroad for quite some time. The Ulysses was published in Paris, and again, with a message from abroad, very much directed to the audience back home. If you just want one famous quote Joyce himself did on the Ulysses, it was the following: if Dublin one day suddenly disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed out of my book. So this is what I would give to the panel to discuss further as what I find the most thought-provoking follow-up. The look by the outsider on the other, which is an image on the other, seen from a distance. You might sometimes think maybe prejudiced, maybe biased, but sometimes perhaps even clearer than the one who is too close. Like in the Hans Christian Andersen's Emperor's New Clothes, where it's the child that suddenly sees what all the others talk around. Or you could say it's a positive child effect when you see things that the others may not see that are obvious. Anyway, this is the message, or I often use, or that's how I often use, I said it yesterday, the reference to the Irish journal by Heinrich Böll, to compare this view of the time with the island today. And let's face it, if we really tried to rebuild Dublin according to the Ulysses, it would be difficult to have all modern Dublin, downtown Dublin, I think, really rebuilt, as Joyce said. That's a joke, of course. Anyway, I think, dear Professor Kerstin May, you're the master of ceremony. I hope enough food for thought to go into cycle 2 of our nice project tonight. And I really thank you, John, Catherine, to the organizers for following up on this little idea that we had. And I think it's a nice and a thought-provoking one, which certainly tonight's panel will show. Good luck. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite the chair for this evening's discussion, Professor Kerstin May, President of the University of Limerick.
Good evening, everyone. Very welcome to the panel discussion. The German ambassador, Claude Mayer-Claude, has set the task for us to discuss here tonight, and I feel really humbled to be in the presence of such eminent poets, writers, academics, artists, and translators. And I think what all panel members unites is their lived experience in different cultural contexts, which enables them to have the insider-outsider perspective that you described in your introductions. All of them are multi-award winning for the work that they have done. They have all experience in translation of different kinds of works. And before we start the discussion, allow me to give short introductions of the guests here in this round. So to my left is Sujata Bhatt, a multi-award winning poet, translator of Indian origin, who grew up and studied in the US with a MFA in creative writing. And she now lives in Bremen. She has published 9 volumes of poetry with the UK-based Carcanet Press and is currently working on 2 parallel projects, on a collection of poems called Habitat and on Dr. Works Leopard, all to be published this year. And that will be your departure into prose, I understand. Sort of. And you have also been a poet in residence here in the Böll cottage in Ackel, amongst many other residencies that you had. And then to your left is Michael Augustin, German-born broadcaster, award-winning writer, poet, visual poet and artist, a director of the International Literature Festival, Poetry on the Road, and someone who has always promoted poetry also with the International Poetry Caravan. You have a background in literature and folklore. You studied at University College in Dublin and also in Kiel, and you live in Bremen. And amongst your works are poetry for children, radio documentaries. 6 volumes of your poetry has been published also in English by the Red Fox Press, and I have to say I was particularly captured by one volume, which in the English translation reads "Only the urn swims." I hope that's the right translation. And you've also been a writer in residence at Dickinson College in the US and at the University of Bath. And then to my right is Michael O'Loughlin, who was educated at Trinity College, an award-winning publisher, translator, writer, a screenplay writer, and poet. You set up the Raven Arts Press with Dermot Bolger in 1986. You lived in Barcelona and in Amsterdam. You worked as a translator, and you also have produced screenplays and have produced feature films to your credit. You've been writer in residence in Galway since you returned to Ireland in 2002, writing fellow at Trinity College, and in 2017 you were the UNESCO writer in residence in Prague. And your most recent published works, include the collected poems 1980 to 2015 and Liberty Hall 2021. You also contribute regularly to the Irish Times, and you are a member of Ashtana, which honors artists who made a significant contribution to the Irish creative arts. And then to your right is Professor Gisela Holfter. She's a professor in German and director of the Center for Irish-German Studies and a dear colleague of mine, and a fellow of the Center for British Study at Humboldt University in Berlin. You have a background in German, English, theology, and you keep it very quiet also in music. You studied in Cologne, Cambridge, and St. Louis, US, and you started off as a DAAD, German Academic Exchange lecturer, as a lecturer in New Zealand. You have written academic works on German literature, German-Irish relations, exile, migration, and intercultural studies, and your books include Heinrich, Böll in Ireland, published in 2011, and The Irish Sanctuary, German-Speaking Refugees in Ireland, 1939 to 1945. I would like to start the discussion by asking you all, what do James Joyce and Heinrich Böll mean to you as writers, as academics? And maybe, Michael, I can start off with you.
Yes, my pleasure. And I have about 1 hour for my statement? Yeah, okay. Well, of course, Heinrich Böll was a presence in my life from my school days. In school, we were reading his short stories, and later, while I was looking for political orientation, Heinrich Böll also played a very important role in a very tense atmosphere in Germany in the early 70s, when there was real hysteria in the country, when there were acts of terrorism in Germany, and the state, in my opinion, overreacted in that time. It was really a weird time. Going into a pub, for example, you knew that the publican behind the counter had the wanted posters and was looking at unknown faces and wondering whether one of the terrorists had come into the place. And Heinrich Böll was one of the few sane voices at that time who expressed, who warned people, who warned the state to overreact in that situation. And he paid very dearly for his engagement, because he was the victim of he and his family, actually, René can tell a lot of stories about that. They were the victims of a campaign by the yellow press in Germany, by the Springer conglomerate of newspapers, especially the Bild-Zeitung. So that was really wonderful to see this man, Heinrich Böll, stand up against this hysteria, and that was really important for us. As a writer, for me, Böll was very important because he was one of the founders, the initiators of the German Writers' Union. In 1971, I think it was, or was it in 1970, he gave a very famous speech, The End of Modesty, in which he claims the right of authors to earn money with their writing. So I don't want to go into detail, but that was a very important initiative Böll took, and a lot has changed in publishing and in regular pay for authors in Germany. So Böll as a politician, that's a big thing. But then, of course, I came to Ireland for the first time in my life in 1970, I think, and I hadn't read the Irish Journal at that time, but afterwards I read it, and I thought, interesting what he wrote, but we are going to discuss that, I suppose, later. So then later in my radio days, I was working as a broadcaster for Radio Bremen for a long time. Heinrich Böll turned up very often, and it was a pleasure not only to work with his written work, but also with the incredible amounts of interviews he gave throughout his working life as a broadcaster. So it was fantastic to work with that material, which is available from the German sound archives, the German radio archives. James Joyce. I read my first Joyce book as a schoolboy, actually. I didn't understand much, but I was fascinated by it. And I really went serious about James Joyce when I was in UCD, and I studied folklore and Anglo-Irish literature, when a friend told me that in Newman House, the old university where Joyce once was a student, that there was a group of people studying Finnegan's Wake. There was a greengrocer, there was a bus conductor, there was an American professor there, and there were some people like me. And my job was, we were reading one page of Finnegan's Wake a week, and my job was to sort out all the German allusions and German words which turned up on that page. It was fantastic. It was one of the greatest reading experiences I ever had. So that much for now, and I pass on to Sujata.
Oh, you want me? Oh, okay. I'll start with, is the sound quality all right? Okay. My name is Sujata Bhatt, and as Kirsten said, I was born in India and grew up in India and the US. I'll start with Joyce because I encountered his work for the first time in school at the age of 15 in Connecticut. It was a very good school and we had lots of resources, so we also, in those days, that was the early 70s, we had records of Irish actors reading Joyce, and our teacher would play the records so we could appreciate the different accent and just the sound quality in his writing. And for me, that was one of the writers whom I was reading frequently and intensively since my teenage years and my formative years. And obviously, like many other writers, he influenced me in many different ways, and just also just revealing a very unique way of presenting the flow of narration and the breaking of narration. I also read Nora Joyce's biography when it came out some years ago, and I was going to just read a quotation from the biography, a very brief quotation, what Nora says. If you could just hold this. I have to. So I used the quotation. Okay, thanks. At the beginning of the poem, and I'll just read the quotation. And this is what Nora said one day, talking to, I suppose, a journalist or a literary critic. I go to bed, and then that man sits in the next room and continues laughing about his own writing. And then I knock on the door and I say, "Now, Jim, stop writing or stop laughing." And for me, that kind of reflected the down-to-earth, very human level of one aspect of their relationship. And as many of you know, Nora embodied Ireland for Joyce while they were outside Ireland, and it was listening. What Joyce really loved was to listen to Nora talk about her childhood in Ireland and her experiences, and he worked that into his own writing. So for that much about Joyce. And about Heinrich Böll, unfortunately I came to Heinrich Böll very late in life, only after I was living in Germany, and I've been reading about him and his work for some years now, and it has also been through listening to Michael and to Renee that I have learned more about Heinrich Böll. And again, I would like to present a very human aspect in his writing, a poem of his called Angel, which Michael and I translated some time ago. And this appears to be for Victor Herman. Angel. Angel, if you search for him, he is earth, between the stones at Slieve Moor, ready to rise, if you call him, without power, without glory, call like a brother if you search for him. Teuton, he was a Jew, a Christian, earth he is. For blackthorn, fuchsia, gorse, between the stars at Slieve Moor, if you search for him, if you find him, angel, make him new, not of blood, not of bile, but of tears, make him new, if you find him.
Thank you very much for that. And can I ask the same question to you, Michael? What does James Joyce and what does Heinrich Böll mean to you?
Yeah, well, when I saw the title of this discussion, I thought, Joyce, Böll, Europe, that's like my life in 3 words. It's that whole, all my life until now and all my work has been kind of underwritten by the sort of dynamic of moving from the east to the west and the west to the east. So here you have a man from the west going east, a man from the east going west. And that whole moving from the imagined center to the imagined margin, and likewise. And that's what I've been doing all my life, until now anyway. Might change. But as somebody who was born and grew up in Dublin, Joyce always has a special meaning for Dubliners, because you start reading him very early, and you tend to, it's incorporated into the fabric of the way you think about the city you live in. And I'm a Joycean in many ways, and I read Joyce all the time still, but I don't think his work has had a huge influence on me, because he was a really bad poet, and I'm kind of more interested in poetry. Unfortunately, his life did have a big influence on me, because when I was 15 or 16, I thought, well, you know, silence, exile, cunning, that sounds good to me. And the first opportunity I get, I'm heading east. And that's more or less what I've been doing all my life. And with Böll, it's kind of more interesting, because much as I love Joyce, it's not the kind of literature that I love in a way. I've always been more interested in what Roberto Calasso called absolute literature. And that's mainly, so the captains of my soul have always been more French, German, Russian than Irish or English writers. And when I was a teenager reading Joyce, I was also reading Musil and Rilke, Kafka, of course, and Godfrey Benn. And they were the people who were the real influence on me and my work. And then, of course, I moved on later to the post-war German writers like Günter Grass and Heinrich Böll, of course. And I loved his short stories in particular. And Paul Celan, of course, and Johannes Bobrowski. So German literature became really the literature that meant the most to me. But the thing about Böll was that I spent a lot of my teenage years hitchhiking around Ireland and sleeping in hostels and camping on remote islands in the West. And I would always meet young Germans who, with their backpacks, clutching a copy either of Catcher in the Rye or the Irish Journal. And interesting that what you mentioned, Michael, there were quite a few Germans who were actually in the West, who were actually refugees from the Baader-Meinhof. This is what they were saying. I don't know if it was true or not. It's one of those hidden rooms in Irish history that nobody ever talks about. And I only read the Irish Journal a few years ago when I was a resident here in the Heinrich Böll house, because I don't think it was translated into English in the 70s. Was it? Yeah.
English, but the translation is not very good. And
yeah.
the family has been trying to get a better translation, but unfortunately they gave away the rights, the English rights, and they can't get them back.
Okay.
So we have to do with the bad translation.
And it wasn't really easily available either, I think, at the time. So I never read it, as I say, until recently. But then I thought this was a very interesting thing, but I didn't really have access to it. And then later on I realized that what was happening was actually, like the Joyce Böll thing, to me is kind of like a mirror image kind of dynamic, because when I was 17 or 18, I traveled around Eastern Europe and a lot, and what Milan Kundera called Central Europe. So I was going to Prague, and I was meeting young Czechs in beer cellars and boring them to death with talk about Kafka, which turned out was a name not to drop in Prague. So Europe has been, the whole issue of Europe, which I think we'll probably be discussing in greater detail a bit later, the whole issue of Europe has been central to my work. And I think in a way you could say it did start with Joyce and with Böll, and what they represent in terms of North Pole, South Pole.
Right, I'm feeling a little bit like your mirror image, because I was one of these Germans clutching my backpack and going to the west of Ireland, and to be precise, it was a place on the Dingle Peninsula, Ballyferrita, almost 40 years ago now. And when I came back, I was boring everyone to death in Germany about Ireland, and I remember covering my copy in my English class with chamber music, Joyce's strings in the air, and the earth and the air, and make music sweet and all of that. And I was reading Frank O'Connor and Sean O'Felin and everything that I could get anything to do with Ireland had me. And I unfortunately wouldn't shut up about it. This changed later on, don't worry. And then it became New Zealand. So at this stage, I'm fairly safe. Joyce didn't quite have this grip that then Böll had later on. And that came really quite a bit later. I didn't read the Irish Journal before I came here, and I didn't read it for a while afterwards. And then I was fascinated by travel literature, and particularly the travel literature written by Germans about Ireland from 1785 onwards. And of course, the Irish Journal is the book that had the most influence. Although there were a few others. I could bore you with this now, but I won't. And then, as part of my studies, I spent quite a lot of time in the Heinrich Böll archive in Cologne, and this is still, for me, I haven't been there for quite a while, far too long now, but I still feel a bit at home there, as much as I feel much more at home now in Eckel, but for me that was a bit of an academic home, and I really enjoyed working with Jochen Schubert, who had also this wonderful exploration of Ulysses and the impact on Böll, and Markus Schäfer, and for me that was always a place to come to and a home. And then in 1997, I think, I was invited to a TV program about Heinrich Böll for his 80th birthday. And I didn't have my PhD that long then. I was convinced, I couldn't sleep for nights before because I was convinced they would take away the PhD off me. I was in Limerick at that stage already, and I thought I'm going back to Cologne, and that would be it. All my career would be over because I would manifest on TV that I'm completely useless. So it was an interesting one then, because I was convinced the only reason why they would invite me, of course, was about me talking about Ireland, Heinrich Böll and Ireland. They didn't. I was the only woman on the panel, and what did they ask me? Whether I found the women in Heinrich Böll's work inspirational. And kind of, what? So I proceeded to talk about the Heinrich Böll archive and the wonderful work, and they did. But anyway, so there are misunderstandings, I think, and there are misunderstandings you can find, I think, for Joyce. You can find quite a few misunderstandings for Heinrich Böll, also in the context of Ireland, but overall you can go back to something that we had earlier on, the topic of connections. And I think there was a strong connection for both writers, obviously, with Europe. There was not a very strong connection for Joyce with Böll for chronological reasons, but I think there was a very strong connection for Böll with Joyce. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And maybe I can take up the last points that both of you made and that came through in your remarks as well. To what extent do you see Joyce and Böll as European writers, not just as writers in Europe, but as European writers? And Michael, perhaps I can start off with you, because you already hinted at that.
I think certainly Joyce, I know, did see himself not just as a European writer, but as a universal writer. I don't know if Joyce was particularly obsessed with the idea of Europe as such. I think he was looking at a much broader kind of cultural thing. I think with Böll, yes, because of Böll's life experience, and it was quite astonishing. I was last night. I was looking at an illustration on the wall over in the hall, which is from Böll's war diaries, and he made a handwritten list of everywhere he'd been in his time serving in the army, and he'd been all over Europe, really, including the Ukraine, which we might talk about later. And he was definitely a European writer in his experience, in the sense that what he experienced total war, he experienced displacement, then he experienced the kind of post-war political difficulties that we thought had gone away and now have all come back again. So yeah, both, well, as I say, Böll more European, for me more an example of a European writer. Joyce, yes, European in the greater sense, perhaps.
Thank you for that, and I hand over to Michael.
Yeah, I think you can see Joyce as a migrant, as an exile, self-imposed exile man, but you can also see him as a refugee because he had to leave the Austro-Hungarian Empire when the First World War happened. His brother was arrested in Trieste because they thought he might be a spy for the other side, so they took refuge in Zurich at that time for the first time, and the same thing happened in 1939. They had to hurriedly leave France, and they had great difficulties finding access to Zurich at that time, but with the help of friends, they got a visa for the country. So that's a strong European experience, I think. And as you said, Böll, in a way, became a European by force, because he was probably very happy in his hometown, Cologne, but he had to leave the country when he was just about to study, and he had to leave the country not on a tourism trip, but the type of tourism many Europeans have experienced over the centuries. He was sent as a soldier, and he was in, I also jotted it down, he was in France, in Romania, he was on Crimea, he was in Russia, he was in Poland, he was in Belgium, and in Hungary. It is unbelievable, you know, and he was wounded in between. He was sent back to Germany, and then he was sent out again. That is a strong European experience both men have made in their lives. And so I thought, when I first saw the question, Böll, Joyce, European, there used to be a question mark behind it. I thought, what a question. Of course they are European. If there are any European writers, these two guys are.
Can I pass over the microphone to Gisela? What's your view on the European?
Yeah, and I think if we look the other way around, to what extent did Böll and Joyce symbolize German and Irish literature across in Europe? I mean, that's, I think, a fascinating question as well. And I think Joyce is we did a book, Island in the European Eye, just a couple of years ago, and it was kind of in every kind of in the Scandinavian countries, France, Spain, everywhere. Poland fairly late. I thought it was very interesting, but there's no question Joyce was really one of the key writers, and there's also no question that in the post-war period, it was Böll who kind of rectified, to some extent, not rectified, but kind of made it possible that German literature could be read again in a way that wouldn't have been possible without anyone of his stature, with his writing, but with his conscience. And I know he didn't like this almost demand that he would be the conscience of Germany. That would be something that everyone should be like, not kind of something fostered on a writer. But he was. I mean, he did really, and we had actually here at the Heinrich Böll weekend a wonderful lecture by a Czech scholar, how important his writings were in Europe after the war. And I think that's, so, I mean, it works both ways. Böll was definitely influenced by a lot of not only Irish literature, but a lot of European literature as well, and was very interested. But at the same time, always within Germany, always with this engagement as well, this kind of, and very contemporary. That's quite different to Joyce. But it really had a huge impact within the whole of Europe and beyond.
Sujata, can I bring you in here as well?
Oh, yes, I wanted to respond to what Gisela said. And I think that's very important that Böll's writing made it on one level possible to read German literature again, because as you know, the Nazis polluted the German language, and Paul Celan and Ingeborg Bachmann have poems addressed to each other in which they allude to the dark words and allude to this polluted language which they are trying to purify through their poetry. And Böll, of course, does it in a brilliant way, with not only with his writing, but with his whole life and the way he was and the way he lived and conducted himself. And what about Europeans? Oh, okay. There was one thing I wanted to quote. Sorry. Okay, sorry. This is from quotation from Professor Anne Fogarty about Joyce, and so it's entirely what she said in one of her talks, and I thought it was very appropriate right now. For Joyce, this is what Professor Fogarty is saying. For Joyce, to be European is a quintessential aspect of the Irish identity that he worked through his art to reclaim. Being Irish and being European were warring categories for Joyce, but his work takes advantage of the friction between identities and the political possibilities that reside in being Irish, multinational, and ultimately a citizen of nowhere except of the artistic imagination.
That's very good.
Yeah. And thank you, Sujata, because that actually leads us to the third question that I have, and bearing in mind your opening remarks, Ambassador, in terms of the insider and outsider perspectives that Joyce had and Böll had due to the experience that you also hold, because you have very different cultural experiences that have formed you. Where do you see the relevance, or do you see a relevance of Joyce and Böll at this very moment when we have to reconsider what Europe means in the face of a war in Europe, in what has been called a Zeitenwende, a change of times on a global scale, where Europe also has to redefine its position, where we all have to, I think, look at our own positioning. So perhaps you could share your thoughts on that also from your own positions as authors and as individuals. Don't know who would like to start, Mike.
Yeah, I think for the Irish that's a particular issue, in the sense that we used to perhaps think of ourselves as outsiders in Europe a little bit, because Europe was always over there and we were here. The continent. So I mean, even now people still say, "Oh, I'm going to Europe next week," as if we are not part of it, and that's always an issue, I think. And I don't think it's particularly a profound political issue. I think it's just being on an island. It's always going to be a little bit like that. People in Achill probably have the same mentality with regard to Ireland, but I think it's very difficult to grasp certain historical processes when you're right in the middle of them. And one of those historical processes that's happening now that we can just barely feel is the creation of the Europe that will eventually come into being, and that seems to be suddenly hardening in shape, which even 5 years ago was problematic. when you were talking, we mentioned Paul Celan, and I remember he once said to Yves Bonnefoy, the great French poet, they were discussing European culture, and he said, you know, the thing is, Yves, you're inside and we're outside. By outside, he meant Romania, basically. And there's still, even in Ireland, we have that particular idea, as did Joyce, that France is like a marker for European culture. I mean, the French still think that they are European culture, but it is getting, at least Macron does, but it is getting bigger. But that European identity is very, very difficult to define, partly because we live, unfortunately, in what are basically ethno-nationalist states, even at this stage. And it's very difficult to break down those barriers. And in fact, I was just reading an article by a Polish economist in The Guardian a few days ago, in which he argued very strongly in favor of building up national economies. And it was a mind-bending article. You know, she was talking about building up Polish industry. And you think, you know, it's like you go one step forward, 2 steps back all the time. So I think it's very true that there is a Europe of the mind and a cultural Europe that we're all part of. And writers and artists in general don't have an issue with that. I remember once being, 30 years ago, I was on a jury for some European prize, and the people who were running the prize, you know, the administrators, it was like the same people who do the Booker Prize, and they were talking about one French writer who was Moroccan, who had never lived in France, but he wrote in French, and the organisers were saying, well, is he really a French writer? And everybody all the writers said, of course he's a French writer. There's not an issue here. It doesn't matter what his passport is or his nationality. He's European, he's French. But politicians seem to always lag behind in that kind of discussion. So I don't think anybody is outside of Europe at the moment. Even the Ukraine feels itself to be inside Europe. Because the issue there, of course, is that there are many Russians who feel they're inside Europe as well. Russia, parts of Russia anyway, are European and are part of that European culture. And that cannot be argued against. But I think Joyce and Böll were both people who felt very central to European culture. It's hard to imagine them as in any other position as outsiders. But then within Europe, there are dynamics going on between the centre and the margin, which we still don't really appreciate, I can't really get our heads around. At least I can't, no matter how hard I try. And it's not a question of economics or politics. It's deeper than that. It has to do with identity. Until you reach such a stage where there's an overriding European identity. I mean, I'm quite happy to say, and I have said all my life, I'm a European first, a Dubliner second, and Irish third. But the question is, you have to reach critical mass with that kind of thing, where a majority of people in Europe say, we are in Europe, we're Europeans. And the national thing is another thing. Nothing wrong with national identity on a personal level. That's fine. The question is, how does it work on the greater scale? But I don't think you can talk about anybody in Europe being outside Europe, except the Brits, of course. But they're always a special case. But even the British are inside Europe in cultural ways. I remember there's a poet that everybody now forgets called Sidney Barnett-Smith, and when Ireland was voting to join the EU, he said, this is ridiculous, because how can you join something that you're already part of? We're part of Europe already. And equally, you can't leave Europe. Even if you vote to leave Europe, you're still going to be the same part of it. So the inside-outside thing, I don't think really is as relevant as it was, perhaps.
from Michael.
But it can also be a question of deficit of knowledge about the outsiders in inverted commas. I think now, for example, the Ukraine war has led to a lot of translations from, as a poet I can say that, of Ukrainian poetry. So there are several publishers in Germany who now suddenly presented anthologies of Ukrainian poetry from the beginnings until nowadays, or even war poetry, which was written within the past year. and lots of it unpublished by soldiers, by civilians, by other people. And I think a lot of that is happening at the moment, not only with Ukraine and our part of the world, but also in general, that in poetry, a lot of translations are being done from the lesser spoken languages into the more spoken languages. And I think there's really something going on. Networking has become a very dominant thing in a way in the literary scene. And I think that will also add to the fact that nobody is left behind, that we know of each other and about each other. And I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, okay. But there's, I was thinking of other levels of inside and outside. And also last night, some of us were talking about the freedom one feels when, okay, all things considered, if, if one is not leaving a country under dire straits, but if one is leaving a country to live somewhere else, but is free to return home and is not suffering. Say, but for example, a student from Ireland who goes to Germany, for example, might feel, or to France, might feel a sense of freedom to be in a place where they don't know anyone at first, and they don't know all the cultural nuances right away. But the population views the person as a foreigner, and so is indulgent towards him or her, and doesn't expect them to know the rules. So they're free to be who they are with the home culture, not passing judgment on them, and the new culture saying, oh, they're foreign, so you can't expect you can't expect them to know what to do. Sorry. And that's a very special aspect of inside and outside. And I was just thinking, how long does one have to live somewhere to really be an insider in their culture? Or are you always on some level outside the culture, even though you have glimpses of being inside or are intimately connected, or maybe on some levels you are, but then you're still an outsider because of who you are? Or is that your perception, or does the other culture make you feel that you are an outsider? So sorry, I was thinking of that, and I was also thinking of, I think, I don't know who coined the terms, but you all know that there are very visible foreigners and very invisible foreigners, depending on the place you go to. So if someone from Ireland goes to France or Germany, unless they start talking, most people wouldn't know where they are coming from if they are white Irish and go to another predominantly white country. But if someone like me goes anywhere in Europe, nobody would know. They could guess where I'm from, but they would all know that I'm not of the country. And I suppose the only country in Europe where 30 years ago I felt I was made to feel very welcome was Holland, because of their colonial history. And many Dutch people by that time were very welcoming and would start talking to me in Dutch because they thought I was Dutch also. And so there are all these different levels of the inside, outside. And I was also thinking that when a grown-up goes to live in another country, they're already formed to a great extent, no matter how much more they learn. But if a child goes or is forced to live in several countries, that affects them in a different way with the culture, which is very obvious.
Thank you, Sujata. Bringing it perhaps back to Joyce and Böll, Gisela, the insider, outsider.
Well, I'll just pick up from that, from the kind of being indulgent, and I think on the question of kind of how long you'll be an outsider, I'm sure the question of being a blow-in will be, well, I'll probably always be a blow-in, but at the same time very happily so. And I think to come back to Böll, I would say, and it's something that René said earlier about being home here in some way, and I do think that despite being an outsider, there was the feeling of having a second home here, and that there was a lot of indulgence given, and I think a lot of freedom, just what you said, not being in Germany and not having these ongoing expectations of what you had to say or that you always had to fulfill obligations. So I'm sure that the second home of Ireland did give a lot of freedom that then also gave some strength again to go back to Germany, at least I hope so. And to come back to the question of how are we kind of dealing with the legacy today in terms of Böll and Joyce, and how do we deal with taking in the European heritage? How do we how do we deal with the challenges? And I think Böll was the one who was far more engaged in contemporary issues, in contemporary political questions, challenges. I think he would have been one of the people who would have been very welcoming towards the Ukrainian refugees coming. He would have been the one very concerned about political developments, and to some extent I think his ongoing engagement is something that is very relevant today and will never cease to be relevant. So that's rather.
And given that it's now 10:05, Gisela, perhaps we can take your remarks almost as concluding marks, wrapping up the legacy of Heinrich Böll, and I think that shows in particular the one dimension of literature, the active participation in the contemporary formation of thoughts, and Joyce, on the other hand, with his experiences of living in many countries, establishing literature as an area where identities, where perspectives could be creatively navigated and relativated. And I think we need both in a contemporary situation where literature is a powerful tool to shape our perceptions and inform where we're going in the future. And I would like to thank you, Michael Augustin, Sujata Bhatt, Gisela Hofter, and Michael O'Loughlin very much for sharing so generously your thoughts tonight in a very stimulating debate. Thank you, and thank you very much to all of you for coming.
Say thank you. Do you want to play? Yeah. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to our panel this evening. It was an enlightening discussion, and I'm going to ask Leisha just to play one more tune for us this evening. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, very short little tune. And I just want to say, in keeping with what the discussion, which I've really enjoyed there, I'm a blow-in. I'm an outsider. I've been in ACL for 15 years, and I'd say if I last another 50, I will still be a blow-in. And I'm only from Westport up the road. But in keeping with that theme and refugees and all that, I have a tune that was collected from a Mayo Harper who was born in 1737, imagine. And his tune was taken down, and his name is Hugh Higgins. I've done a lot of research on him, and I love bringing these old tunes to life, but it has the fantastic title of My Lodgings Uncertain Wherever I Go. And so a title for our times, the same old story. So thank you, everybody. Thanks a million.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this evening. Thank you very much to our speakers, our readers, our panel, our discussion, to René, the ambassador, the Heinrich Böll Association for hosting this evening. I want to wish you all a safe home. And before we go, two things. The first is that tomorrow's walk at the Crannog, wear suitable clothing and proper walking gear, walking boots. How to access it, the easiest way is if you know where the Heinrich Böll cottage is and take the left turn there At the end of that road, we're going to park. We're all going to park on the same side of the road. Then we have to cross the main road to the dirt track the other side, and that's where the walk will be from. So just be careful crossing the main road. But please park everybody on the same side to allow traffic to come back and forth on that road. And the second thing I'd like to say is we do have an online survey, and we'd appreciate if you did fill it in, and it helps us to plan our future events for the Heinrich Böll weekend. Everybody, safe home, good night, and thank you very much.